Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we have a show that connects dots the mainstream press refuses to connect. We're covering 5 stories that, on the surface, look like separate events: Turkey's stance on Iran, a UN Security Council vote, millions displaced in Iran, Al-Aqsa Mosque closures during Ramadan, and US Navy provocations in the Taiwan Strait. But when you lay them side by side, you see the architecture of a single imperial project. Maya, let's get into it.
Let's start with Turkey, because this is a story that tells you everything about the fault lines forming right now. Turkey's foreign minister came out and said explicitly, there should be no regime change in Iran. Now, why does that matter? Because it tells you that NATO's second-largest military is drawing a red line against what Washington is clearly angling for. Turkey sees what's happening. The bombing campaign, the diplomatic isolation, the sanctions, this is the regime change playbook we've seen in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. And Turkey is saying, not this time. That's a seismic statement from a NATO ally, reported by Middle East Eye.
And let's be precise about why Turkey is taking this position. It's not altruism. Turkey shares a border with Iran. A collapsed Iranian state means millions of refugees flowing into Turkey, it means Kurdish militant groups exploiting a power vacuum, it means complete destabilization of Turkey's eastern flank. Ankara learned from the Iraq War. They watched what happened when the US toppled Saddam, chaos that's still reverberating 2 decades later. So when Turkey's foreign minister says no regime change, he's telling Washington, you will not use our neighborhood as your laboratory again.
And here's what the Western press buries in that story. The United States reportedly dropped certain preconditions for negotiations with Iran, that's in the Middle East Eye reporting. So on one hand, you have Washington signaling diplomatic flexibility, and on the other hand, you have an active bombing campaign and a UN Security Council that just condemned Iran without even mentioning the US and Israel. That's not diplomacy. That's a good cop bad cop routine where both cops are carrying assault rifles. Turkey sees through it, and frankly, most of the global South sees through it.
Which brings us to story 2, that UN Security Council vote. This one should make your blood boil. The Security Council voted to condemn Iran's attacks on Gulf states. Now, set aside for a moment whether those attacks deserve condemnation. The resolution does not mention the United States. It does not mention Israel. It condemns Iran's military actions while saying absolutely nothing about the military campaign being waged against Iran. Think about what that means. The body that is supposed to represent international law just told the world that only certain countries' violence counts.
This is the weaponization of international institutions in real time, Alex. The UN Security Council is supposed to be a neutral arbiter. But when you draft a resolution that condemns the retaliatory strikes while ignoring the initial aggression, you're not pursuing peace, you're providing legal cover for war. And who pushed this resolution? The United States and its allies, who hold veto power and structural control over the Council. Russia and China likely objected to the framing, but the resolution passed. That tells you about the diplomatic arm-twisting happening behind closed doors. Middle East Eye reported this, and almost no major Western outlet gave it the critical scrutiny it deserves.
Let me connect this to the human cost, because that's story 3, and it's the one that should be leading every newscast in America. The United Nations, not an advocacy group, not a foreign government, the United Nations itself, says that 3.2 million people have been displaced inside Iran as a result of the US-Israeli war. 3.2 million human beings who had homes, jobs, schools, hospitals, who are now refugees in their own country. That number is staggering, and I want everyone listening to sit with it. When we bombed Iraq, we created a displacement crisis that destabilized an entire region for a generation. We are doing it again.
And the scale of this displacement tells you something about the nature of the military campaign. You don't displace 3.2 million people with targeted strikes on military installations. That number means infrastructure is being destroyed: power grids, water treatment facilities, roads, bridges, hospitals. That's what creates mass displacement. When civilians can no longer access clean water, electricity, or medical care, they flee. So when the Pentagon tells you this is a precision campaign targeting Iran's nuclear capabilities, the displacement numbers call that a lie. Middle East Eye is sourcing this directly from UN data, and the American press is treating it as a footnote.
I want to zoom out on the media failure here because it's criminal. 3.2 million displaced, that's larger than the population of Chicago. Imagine if every single person in Chicago was suddenly homeless, wandering the countryside looking for shelter and food. That's what's happening in Iran right now, and CNN is running segments about celebrity gossip. The New York Times buries it on page 12. This is not an accident. The manufacturing of consent requires that the human consequences of American wars remain abstract, remain invisible. Numbers without faces. Displacement without footage. Suffering without names.
And here's the broader pattern. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, the displacement crisis was downplayed for years until it became impossible to ignore. Same with Libya, NATO bombed that country into a failed state, and the refugee crisis was treated as a mysterious phenomenon that just appeared out of nowhere. Now we're watching the same playbook with Iran. The displacement is happening now, the humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding now, and the media is already setting the stage to act surprised about it in 3 years. We have the data. We have the UN reports. There is no excuse for ignorance, only complicity.
Now let's talk about story 4, because this one reveals a dimension of this conflict that goes beyond military strategy into something deeply cultural and religious. 8 Islamic and Arab nations have condemned Israel for closing Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. For those who don't know, Al-Aqsa is the third holiest site in Islam. Ramadan is the holiest month in the Islamic calendar. Closing Al-Aqsa during Ramadan is the equivalent of barricading St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas. It is a deliberate provocation designed to humiliate, and Middle East reported the international condemnation it triggered.
And let's be clear about why this matters beyond the religious dimension. Al-Aqsa sits in occupied East Jerusalem, territory that the international community, including the United Nations, considers illegally occupied by Israel. So when Israel restricts access to Al-Aqsa, it's not just a religious provocation, it's an assertion of sovereign control over territory it has no legal right to control. The closure during Ramadan is Israel telling 2 billion Muslims worldwide, "We own this site, and your holiest traditions are subject to our security decisions." 8 nations condemned it, but condemnation without consequences is just performance.
And notice the timing, Maya. This isn't happening in a vacuum. You have an active war on Iran, a Security Council that just gave the US and Israel diplomatic cover, 3.2 million people displaced, and simultaneously, Israel is tightening its grip on one of Islam's holiest sites. This is a coordinated escalation across multiple fronts, military, diplomatic, and now religious and cultural. The Al-Aqsa closure is designed to provoke a reaction, which then gets used to justify further crackdowns. It's a cycle of provocation and retaliation that Israel has perfected over decades, and it's accelerating right now.
The 8 nations that issued the condemnation, we need to ask a harder question about them too. Condemnation is easy. Statements are free. What are these nations actually doing? Are they recalling ambassadors? Are they imposing economic sanctions? Are they restricting airspace or port access? Because if the answer is no, then the condemnation is theater, and it tells you that even Muslim-majority nations are constrained by their economic and military relationships with Washington. The US has built a system where even outrage is managed, where even righteous anger gets channeled into press releases that change absolutely nothing.
That's exactly right. And it connects to the Turkey story. Turkey is one of the few nations that has the military and economic weight to back up its rhetoric. When Turkey says no regime change in Iran, it carries weight because Turkey can actually complicate American plans. But most of the nations condemning the Al-Aqsa closure, they're trapped. They depend on American weapons, American trade agreements, American security guarantees. So they condemn and they comply. They issue statements and they open their airspace. That's the architecture of empire. You build a system where resistance is structurally impossible, and then you call it a rules-based order.
Now let's pivot to the Pacific, because Story 5 shows you that this imperial architecture isn't limited to the Middle East. The US Navy just sent a P-8A Poseidon, that's a submarine hunting aircraft, through the Taiwan Strait, right before a scheduled summit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. The South China Morning Post reports this triggered PLA jet maneuvers near Taiwan. Let me be clear about what happened. The United States deliberately provoked a military confrontation in the most sensitive waterway in Asia, weeks before a diplomatic meeting. That's not pursuing peace. That's negotiating with a gun on the table.
And the language the U.S. 7th Fleet used is telling. They said the transit demonstrated commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. That phrase, free and open Indo-Pacific, is Pentagon marketing language for American military dominance in Asia. There's nothing free about it. The U.S. maintains over 400 military bases ringing China. It has mutual defense treaties that effectively turn Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia into forward operating positions. When they say free and open, they mean free for American warships and open to American power projection. The South China Morning Post's reporting makes this context clear.
And the timing is the key, Alex. This patrol happened before the Xi-Trump summit. In diplomacy, you don't escalate before a negotiation unless you want to negotiate from a position of intimidation. The message to Beijing is unmistakable: we can operate in your backyard whenever we want, and there's nothing you can do about it. The PLA responded with jet maneuvers, which is exactly what Washington wanted, because now the American press can run headlines about Chinese aggression near Taiwan, completely stripping the context that the US provoked the response. It's the same provocation-response cycle we just discussed with Al-Aqsa.
Let me connect all 5 stories now, because this is where Truth Report earns its name. What are we actually looking at? In the Middle East, the United States and Israel are waging war on Iran, displacing millions, getting diplomatic cover from the UN Security Council, and simultaneously escalating religious tensions at Al-Aqsa. Turkey is pushing back, but most nations are issuing toothless condemnations. In the Pacific, the US is provoking China before a summit. This is a country that is simultaneously waging or threatening war on 2 fronts, against 2 major regional powers, while its institutions provide legal and moral cover. That's not defense. That's empire.
And here's what binds it all together: the economics. Iran sits on the 4th largest proven oil reserves in the world. The Taiwan Strait is the corridor through which 60% of global shipping passes. Control Iran's oil and control the Taiwan Strait, and you control the global economy. Every story we covered tonight, every single one, connects back to resource control and trade route dominance. Turkey knows this. China knows this. The 8 nations condemning the Al-Aqsa closure know this. The only people who don't seem to know it are American citizens, because our media presents each of these stories as isolated incidents with no common thread.
And the displacement of 3.2 million Iranians. That's not a side effect, it's a feature. Displacement breaks social cohesion. It destroys the networks of trust and mutual aid that communities need to resist occupation or puppet governments. When you displace a population, you create dependency on whatever authority fills the vacuum. We saw this in Iraq, where displacement enabled sectarian division, which enabled permanent military bases, which enabled control of oil fields. The humanitarian crisis is the strategy. The suffering is the point, because broken populations don't resist, they survive.
I want to address something that the mainstream press does consistently, which is frame all of this as complexity. They say the Middle East is complicated, the Taiwan situation is nuanced, international law is ambiguous. It's not. A country that bombs another country and displaces 3.2 million people is an aggressor. A Security Council resolution that condemns the victim without naming the aggressor is propaganda. A military patrol designed to provoke before a peace summit is sabotage. A mosque closure during a holy month is collective punishment. These are not complicated. They're crimes described in clear language by people who benefit from the confusion.
Let's talk about who benefits, because following the money always clarifies the picture. Defense contractors are posting record profits. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, their stock prices correlate directly with escalation. Every Tomahawk missile fired at Iran is a revenue event for these companies. Every P-8A Poseidon patrol in the Taiwan Strait justifies the next defense budget increase. The congressional representatives who vote for these wars hold stock in these companies. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's publicly available financial disclosure data. The people deciding whether to go to war are financially invested in war happening.
And on the other side, who loses? Iranian families who've lost their homes, 3.2 million of them. Palestinian Muslims denied access to their holiest site during their holiest month. Chinese fishermen and merchants whose livelihoods depend on a peaceful Taiwan Strait. American service members deployed to yet another conflict zone. American taxpayers funding billion-dollar weapons systems while their roads crumble and their healthcare bankrupts them. The losers are always the same, ordinary people on every side of every border. The winners are always the same, the arms dealers, the oil companies, and the politicians they purchase.
And here's the part that should make every American deeply uncomfortable. Turkey, a NATO ally, is more clearly opposing this war than the American Congress. 8 Muslim nations are more vocal about religious persecution than American civil liberties organizations. The UN's own data contradicts the narrative the US pushed through the Security Council. When your allies are more honest than your own government, when foreign nations are more protective of human rights than your own institutions, you have to ask, who does this system actually serve? Because it's clearly not serving the American people, and it's clearly not serving peace.
Let me bring up one more dimension that nobody's discussing. The displacement in Iran, the Al-Aqsa closure, the Taiwan Strait provocation, these are all happening during Ramadan. Over 1 billion Muslims worldwide are fasting, praying, and reflecting during the holiest period of their year, and the United States and Israel chose this moment to intensify military operations and restrict access to holy sites. Whether this timing is deliberate or incidental, the message received across the Muslim world is the same: your faith, your traditions, your sacred spaces mean nothing to us. That radicalizes people. That creates the very extremism these wars claim to fight.
Which is the final, ugly truth at the bottom of all of this. The war on terror was supposed to make us safer. 25 years later, the United States is simultaneously antagonizing the Muslim world through war and mosque closures, and the Chinese world through military provocations. We are creating enemies faster than we can count them. Every displaced Iranian family is a recruitment tool for militant groups. Every Al-Aqsa closure inflames 1 billion hearts. Every Taiwan Strait patrol pushes China closer to military readiness. The policy is self-defeating by any rational measure, which tells you that the goal was never safety, the goal was perpetual conflict, because perpetual conflict means perpetual profit.
So what do we do with all of this? Because Truth Report isn't just about diagnosing the disease, it's about prescribing the treatment. First, demand that your representatives address the 3.2 million displaced Iranians. Call their offices. Cite the UN data. Ask them directly, do you support this? Second, support independent journalism. The stories we covered tonight came from Middle East Eye and South China Morning Post, outlets outside the American media ecosystem. The New York Times and CNN are not going to connect these dots for you. Subscribe to independent outlets. Fund the journalism that tells the truth.
Third, follow the money. Look up your congressional representatives' financial disclosures. See if they hold defense stocks. If they do, they have a financial interest in every war they vote for, and you need to hold them accountable at the ballot box. Fourth, talk to people. Break the isolation that the media creates. Share these stories. Discuss them at your dinner tables, in your workplaces, in your communities. The most powerful weapon the war machine has is your silence. They are counting on you to scroll past the 3.2 million displaced, to ignore the mosque closure, to accept the provocation in the Taiwan Strait as normal. Refuse to be silent.
And fifth, and this is critical, reject the framing that any of this is inevitable. It is not inevitable that the United States wages war on Iran. It is not inevitable that Israel closes Al-Aqsa during Ramadan. It is not inevitable that the U.S. Navy provokes China before a peace summit. These are choices made by specific people with specific interests, and they can be unmade by a public that demands different choices. Turkey proved that tonight, a single nation said no, and it shifted the calculus. Imagine what millions of citizens saying no could accomplish. The power is there. It always has been. The question is whether you'll use it.
That's our show for tonight. 5 stories, 1 pattern, the architecture of endless war, maintained by institutional capture, media complicity, and public silence. We've given you the sources: Middle East Eye, South China Morning Post, UN displacement data. Go read them. Verify what we've said. And then act on it. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. This has been Truth Report. The truth doesn't need your belief, it needs your attention. We'll see you next time. Stay informed, stay critical, and never stop asking who benefits. Good night.